What if I told you that the Soviet Union, one of the most powerful empires of the 20th century, was hiding secrets so bizarre, so shocking, and so absurd that most history books never even mention them? Hey everyone, welcome back to Toppi Top History. Today we're exploring 50 of the strangest and most surprising facts about the Soviet Union you probably never knew. From secret experiments to absurd propaganda, these stories prove that reality can be stranger than fiction. Let's dive in. The Soviets once trained dogs to blow up enemy tanks. The plan was to strap bombs to dogs and send them under German vehicles. But in practice, the dogs often ran back to their Soviet handlers or tanks with explosive results. They even tried to rearrange the entire work week. In the 1930s, the USSR introduced a continuous work week where people worked 5 days straight, but everyone's days off were different. The idea was to keep factories running 24/7. The result? Families almost never had the same day off together. When it came to size, the Soviets loved extremes. They built the largest submarine in history, the Typhoon class. It was so massive that inside it had a swimming pool, a sauna, and even a small gym. Nuclear war with a side of luxury. But space was where the USSR truly shocked the world. While Yuri Gagarin is officially remembered as the first man in space, rumors persist of lost cosmonauts, test pilots who may have died in secret missions, erased from the record forever. Censorship in the Soviet Union reached absurd levels. For example, in photos of political meetings, officials who had fallen out of favor were literally airbrushed out of history books. Imagine your boss not only firing you, but erasing you from existence. Stalin himself had peculiar tastes. He once banned jazz as bourgeois decadence, but later Soviet propaganda created its own approved jazz, with lyrics praising tractors, factories, and socialism. Try dancing to swing music about building steel. The USSR also had a fascination with gigantomania. They attempted to build the Palace of the Soviets in Moscow, a skyscraper so huge it would have dwarfed the Empire State Building. But World War II stopped construction, and today the site holds a swimming pool instead. One of the strangest wartime inventions was the Bat Bomb project. Bats fitted with tiny incendiary devices designed to set enemy cities on fire. While the Americans toyed with the idea too, Soviet scientists seriously tested it. Unsurprisingly, chaos ensued. Food shortages led to weird solutions. The USSR once proudly announced the creation of meat made from sawdust. It wasn't exactly edible, but propaganda claimed it was a miracle of science. And finally, the Soviets' passion for secrecy went so far that entire cities were kept off the map. Known as closed cities, they didn't appear on any atlas, and outsiders weren't allowed in. Millions of people lived in these invisible towns, working on nuclear and military projects. When you think of the Soviet Union, you probably imagine gray apartment blocks, long bread lines, and giant parades in Red Square. And while that image isn't wrong, the truth is way stranger than the stereotype. For example, did you know the USSR once created an entire anti-communist cola? Pepsi actually became the first American product sold in the Soviet Union, and in exchange, the Soviets paid with vodka and even military ships. At one point, Pepsi briefly owned the 6th largest navy in the world. That's the kind of deal only the Cold War could invent. But not every Soviet invention was so refreshing. In fact, the USSR had a reputation for massive, weird engineering projects. Take the Buran space shuttle, a near copy of the American space shuttle. It flew only once without a crew, then was abandoned in a dusty hangar. Billions of rubles for a single flight. And speaking of abandoned, the Soviets also built the Trans-Siberian Tunnels project. plans to dig under the frozen land and connect Siberia to Alaska. Imagine taking a train straight under the Bering Strait. Of course, it never happened, but for a while, Soviet engineers swore it was possible. But sometimes absurdity wasn't in science, it was in everyday life. Soap and toilet paper were often scarce, so people resorted to newspapers. It was common to see old Pravda issues repurposed in ways their writers never imagined. Still, propaganda tried to keep morale high. In one campaign, Soviet magazines bragged about the country's man-made moons, giant mirrors in space designed to reflect sunlight onto Soviet cities at night. The project failed, but the idea of a permanent Soviet glow in the sky was very real. And if you think that sounds absurd, listen to this. The USSR once tried to breed superhumans by crossing humans with apes. A scientist named Ilya Ivanov actually conducted experiments to create human-ape hybrids for labor. It failed, but it remains one of the most bizarre episodes in Soviet science. Even their pride in sports had strange moments. In the 1980 Olympics, which the USSR hosted, they built massive facilities, but many of them now stand abandoned, crumbling like relics of a forgotten empire. For a system that promised eternal glory, the ruins speak louder than the parades ever did. And let's not forget language itself. The Soviets introduced endless slogans, abbreviations, and Soviet speak that confused even native speakers. Bureaucracy was so tangled that people joked the USSR didn't run on fuel, but on paper. Finally, here's a lighter one. Soviet children grew up with their own version of Disney, a cartoon studio called Soyuz Multfilm. But instead of Mickey Mouse, they had a mysterious creature called Cherubashka, who looked like a mix between a teddy bear and an alien. To this day, Cherubashka is a cultural icon. Strange drinks, failed shuttles, human-ape experiments, and alien-looking cartoon mascots. The deeper you go into the Soviet Union, the more it feels like a parallel world, running on its own bizarre logic.
The Soviet Union wasn't just a land of giant projects and strange propaganda. Behind the parades and slogans, life often had a much darker side. For example, the USSR secretly built entire underground cities to protect the elite from nuclear war. Ordinary citizens had no chance of entry. While people on the surface stood in bread lines, deep below Moscow, there were bunkers with bedrooms, food, and even theaters for the political class. And speaking of survival, many ordinary families only survived by trading on the black market. While the state bragged about equality, everything from jeans to chewing gum had to be smuggled. A single pair of Levi's jeans could cost a month's salary. Food shortages went so far that in some regions, people stood in line for hours just to buy bones, not even meat. Jokes spread like wildfire. What's long, hard, and full of bones? A Soviet cue. But the darker part wasn't just scarcity, it was silence. In the USSR, there was a system of informants. Neighbors, classmates, even family members could report you to the secret police for telling a joke about the government. And yes, people were arrested for jokes. One of the most absurd propaganda campaigns came during the Cold War. To prove Soviet superiority, scientists attempted to grow giant vegetables using nuclear radiation. The results? Oversized but often inedible crops, proudly displayed at exhibitions as proof of communism's success. Education, too, had its strange side. Children were taught to worship not just Lenin, but also Lenin's body, preserved in a glass mausoleum. For generations, Soviet kids filed past the embalmed corpse as if visiting a sacred relic. And while space was a source of pride, it was also full of secrets. Many cosmonauts suffered from terrible health effects, but their stories were hidden. Some missions that failed simply did not exist on paper. Success was shown, failure was erased. Housing was another daily absurdity. Families were packed into communal apartments, sometimes with 10 or more people sharing a single kitchen and bathroom. Privacy didn't exist. Even in your own home, you were never truly alone. Meanwhile, the government continued to pour resources into military parades and massive monuments, while hospitals lacked basic supplies. For ordinary citizens, the contrast was impossible to ignore. And finally, there was the constant sense of fear. A wrong word, a wrong book, even listening to the wrong music could brand you as an enemy of the state. In a society that promised a bright future, many lived in the shadows of silence. The Soviet Union was a place of ambition and absurdity, but also of secrets and suffering. And it's in this tension that the true story lies.
The Soviet Union wasn't just fear and shortages. Sometimes life there felt like living inside a dark comedy, with moments so absurd you wouldn't believe they actually happened. Take this. In the 1950s, the USSR built a massive loudspeaker system across entire cities to pump out propaganda, music, and news. It wasn't just the radio. These speakers were wired directly into homes. You couldn't turn them off, only turn the volume down. Imagine waking up every morning to government slogans blasting in your living room. And if that wasn't enough control, the government even tried to dictate fashion. Jeans, long hair, and rock music were seen as symbols of Western corruption. Teenagers caught with suspicious clothing could be publicly shamed or even expelled from school. Owning a Beatles record could brand you as an enemy of the state. But the absurdity ran deeper. In the 1960s, the USSR launched a propaganda campaign claiming it had invented the best car in the world. That car was the Lada. It was cheap, it was simple, and it broke constantly. Yet it became a symbol of Soviet pride. Even holidays were strange. On New Year's Eve, instead of Santa Claus, Soviet children waited for Ded Moroz, or Grandfather Frost. But unlike Santa, he wore a long blue coat, carried a staff, and was often accompanied by his granddaughter. For kids, it was magical. For outsiders, it looked bizarre. Food was another area where propaganda clashed with reality. Butter and sausage were so rare that when they appeared in stores, people would queue for hours. Sometimes they didn't even know what they were waiting for. They just saw a line and joined it, hoping for something good. And if you've ever heard of Soviet jokes, you know humor was one of the few ways people coped with all of the absurdity of the Soviet life. A favorite went, "They pretend to pay us and we pretend to work." That one sentence captured the entire absurdity of Soviet economics. Speaking of economics, the ruble was proudly declared the strongest currency, but it was practically worthless outside the USSR. Tourists couldn't use it abroad, and black markets flourished with dollars. Even Soviet science had its bizarre moments. Once, scientists proudly displayed a two-headed dog created through experimental surgery. It lived only briefly, but photos shocked the world. For the USSR, it was framed as scientific progress. And then there was the Soviet obsession with parades. Tanks rolled through Red Square, soldiers marched in perfect lines, and rockets were shown off. But sometimes the rockets were just empty shells, wooden models painted to look impressive. The world saw power. Inside the country, many knew it was theater. Finally, there's the absurd story of bananas. For decades, they were almost impossible to find. When shipments did arrive, people treated bananas like gold. Kids would eat the fruit and then carefully chew on the peel just to make the moment last longer. From loudspeakers you couldn't shut off to wooden rockets, from Ladas to banana peels, the Soviet Union often felt like the world's biggest tragic comedy.
By now, you've seen how the Soviet Union was filled with absurdities, contradictions, and secrets. But the final stories might be the strangest of them all. Let's start with the Kremlin itself. Deep under Moscow lies a massive secret subway system known as Metro 2. It supposedly connects the Kremlin to airports and bunkers. Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, former workers swear they've seen it. And speaking of secrets, the Soviets were obsessed with controlling information. Entire books, movies, even music albums were banned. But here's the twist. Banned items often became more popular underground. Smugglers even copied Western music onto used X-ray films, creating what people called music on the bones. Imagine listening to rock and roll through a vinyl record made from someone's ribcage. Then there's the KGB, infamous for surveillance. But few people know that the agency once tried to train psychic spies. From telepathy to mind reading, projects poured money into the paranormal. No one ever proved it worked, but the idea itself shows how desperate the USSR was to outmatch the West. Some absurdities were just tragic. In the late Soviet years, factories produced millions of useless goods just to meet quotas, like nails so soft they bent instantly, or shoes that fell apart after a week. Workers joked that factories produced garbage by the ton, and in many cases, they were right. But let's not forget Soviet medicine. Hospitals often lacked even basic supplies, so doctors improvised. In rural areas, vodka was sometimes used as an anesthetic. In other cases, surgeries were performed with almost no equipment. Stories that sound medieval but happened in the 20th century. And then there's the absurd battle of Coca-Cola versus Pepsi. When Coca-Cola tried to enter the Soviet market, Stalin demanded a special version without the iconic brown color because it looked too much like Western cola. The result was a clear Coca-Cola bottled just for the USSR. Meanwhile, propaganda kept pushing bigger-than-life stories. In one campaign, they showed off a giant statue of Lenin's head, so big that people joked it could be seen from space. In reality, it couldn't. But the idea of eternal Soviet eyes watching you from orbit captured the mood perfectly. Even religion was caught in the crossfire. Churches were turned into warehouses, gyms, even swimming pools. Some of Russia's most beautiful cathedrals were blown up in the name of progress. The irony? When the USSR collapsed, many of those same churches were rebuilt almost exactly as before. But perhaps the most haunting fact is this. In the 1980s, Soviet officials refused to admit the Chernobyl disaster was happening, even as radiation spread across Europe. For days, citizens in nearby towns continued with parades and celebrations, completely unaware they were walking through invisible poison. And that's the ultimate symbol of the Soviet Union, a place of massive ambition and constant denial, where the truth was often the most forbidden thing of all. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the secrets of the USSR, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Toppi Top History, and share it with your friends. And tell me in the comments which of these Soviet facts shocked you the most. I'm Top, and I'll see you in the next episode where we'll uncover more unbelievable stories from history.